Awesome.
Cool.
I kind of blanked out on what we were reading for this week, so. Okay, let's try that again. Hello, friends, and welcome back to another episode of Snark Squad Pod, the media podcast where we will call you out on your negligent parenting, even if we don't want to see your kids. My name is Madeleine.
And I am Nicole Sweeney.
And I'm Chelsea.
That is our special guest for this week. You may recognize her from around Snark Squad. She has recapped Dawson's Creek for us.
Ooh. That's been a minute.
They may recognize you.
Yeah, you may indeed recognize me from Once Upon a Time.
And why don't you tell them where else they can find you and what else you do around the internet?
Absolutely. You can find me. I live on Twitter, but you've probably heard my voice before on the podcast that I host with Kay Taylor Ray. Not Now, I'm Reading. I am also recently returned to BookTube after like a 6-month hiatus because my 2017 just blew the fuck up, didn't it? So recently returned to my lovely little BookTube channel. But yeah, that's probably where you've heard my voice or seen my face. And I'm very honored and excited to be here to do this episode.
On this week's episode, we're going to be talking about the children's classic A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle. And to give us the plot synopsis, I'm going to hand it over to Chelsea.
All right, here we go, friends. I'm usually not very good at this, but I'm going to give it my solid, college try. So, A Wrinkle in Time is about Meg Murray, who wakes up in the middle of a stormy night for a glass of milk with her mother and her brother, Charles Wallace, when all of a sudden a tramp comes knocking at the door who basically opens the literal door on time and space for Meg and Charles Wallace and their friend Calvin to go have an intergalactic adventure as they search for their physicist father who is gone, who has been lost on some secret government project. And with the help of Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Witch, and Mrs. Who, 3 kind of benevolent creatures, spirits, beings, they are led to the evil planet of Camazaz, where they have to fight something called It, or the Red, for basically control over the planet and the eternal fate of the universe. Yeah?
That's
cool. All right, there we go.
I love how people come on the show and they're like, we're so terrible at this. And then they just throw down a summary.
Because I had to try really hard. I was very intimidated by the Rincey episode when she talked about Kristen. I was very intimidated.
It was a high bar.
Bring my A game. Yeah, for sure.
Well, I would like to get started by just saying that this was the first time that I ever read this book. I came to this as an adult.
Wow.
Yes.
Both of you. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
When was the first time you read this book?
Ooh, damn. Okay, so I read this book in a follow-up. So I spent pretty much every minute of my life before Harry Potter came out reading Dear America books. So then Harry Potter came out and really opened my literal eyes onto this world of fantasy. So I went to the library and I told the children's librarian, I was like, I want that, but not that because I already read it. And this is the first book she handed me. And so it was 95, 96. And I've probably read it 10, 12 times since then. I really fucking like this book, you guys. This is one of my all-time favorite books. This one specifically, because it's the first one of 5, and so it ends in a way that indicates it's the first one of 5, but I have a lot of affection for this particular book.
Well, I think we decided to pick this book specifically because there is a movie adaptation coming out in the next month. And so we wanted to watch that and talk about that. And then we kind of backed into talking about adaptations. But in order to talk about this as an adaptation, we had to read the book first. So we went
It's a very long logic route that led us here. Yeah.
So Sweeney and I are both first-time readers, and so we always like to start off with the easy question that throws us into the deep end, which is, of course, did you like this book? So I know Chelsea's already said that she really likes it.
I'm just not even going to answer again.
Nicole?
Oh, man. So I feel this is this awkward moment of okay, this is your favorite book. I loved this story. This is like going to be a weird way to describe this. I love this story. I did not like this book.
No, that is very fair.
I think that if I came to this as a child, I would have a very different fondness for it. I would have because I just finished reading it last night, and I've been thinking about this, like going over this in my head, because I do know so many people who happen to love this book, and I'm kind of like trying to process what is at the heart of this disconnect between their experience of the thing and my experience of the thing. And I think obviously a huge piece of this is that I am coming to this as at 29 years old
adult.
And not as a child, right? And this is a middle grade book. I don't read a lot of middle grade in general, so that's a piece of this. I think that there is a lot that I like about the sort of core story itself, that if I had kind of childhood memories of that core story, I would be able to carry that fondness with me. But there are certain things about the telling of this story that just... I did not.
Is it a language thing? Is it a pacing?
There's a couple things. Probably the first major stumbling block that I had is that it has been a while since I've had a book preach at me, and it was not my favorite. There's like a couple very, I don't know, wishy-washy, hand-wavy type moments of like, yeah, maybe people who weren't Christians were contributors to like fighting back the darkness, but like basically like they lead with Jesus, and then like throughout the book give us like Bible passages, and so that was like, okay, and I don't know, like the idea of kind of interweaving I don't know. I'm starting to like get off on things that are kind of discussion topics of their own. I want to get to Mari's basic reaction to it. So like, but that's my basic takeaway is that I enjoyed this story enough. I also bought the whole frickin' quintet because the library, the wait list for the book was like bonkers long. So I was like, whatever, I'll just buy the book on Kindle. And then I'm like, looked it up on Amazon. Amazon was like, hey, do you want to just spend another $20 and buy the whole 5-book set? And I was like, yeah, sure. Now I'm like, well, what have I done? But I mean, so now I'm going to finish it because I bought them all. But I'm invested enough in these characters that I don't, and it's easy enough to read that I don't think it'll be torture to get through the rest of it, but I am a little bit like, there is something about the telling of this story that I did not enjoy while still managing to enjoy the story itself, if that makes sense.
Yes.
I had have quibbles with the story, and I think I had that same experience where I was reading it and I was very aware that I was coming to this story as an adult, and there were a lot of times that I could almost see in reading the story the experience of reading something that was similar to me. So my story for me as a child was the Chronicles of Narnia. And the Chronicles of Narnia are almost so similar because they are also very preachy and have these Christian theology undertones. And so there are a lot of things that I love in that story that I saw here. And as an adult, I'm like, not sure if I like that. But it's only because I'm coming to this as an adult. So I was very conscious and aware of that as I was reading. But I finished it today, hours before like recording this, and just in that time that I've sat with it, I've felt my appreciation for the story grow. And so I feel like that I enjoyed the story. I didn't love it immediately, but I feel like this is more a story that grows on you and grows with you, and that is more about analyzing than it is like sitting down and enjoying, unless you are at an early enough age where some of these things are you're just happy to let them like wash over you and accept them as they are. So I will say that my easy answer is that yes, I did enjoy this. Before we get into some of the things that we've briefly touched on that maybe were hangups for us, what were maybe some of your favorite things? And then we can kind of go from there and talk about the good that we found here.
Okay, well, my favorite thing, and the reason that this book so greatly appealed to me at such a young age, is that Meg is very much so a young female character who is allowed to be angry, and who is told that her anger and her frustration and her with situations that warrant anger and frustration is a very valid way to react. And in fact, there is power in feeling those valid emotions in situations that call for them, which, like, as a young woman who was often told the very opposite of that, it meant a lot to me to see a young person who, yes, the ultimate power in this book is love, which I can't say without just like, but she's also very much so, one of her gifts in defeating the ultimate, like, big bad is her anger and her frustration. And it's balancing those two forces that ultimately bring success to kind of the bottle narrative within this first book. And so that was that final scene where she's kind of facing that big bad and she learns to embrace both of those things herself are my favorite parts. I will always have a deep affection for Charles Wallace. And, like, before the internet comes at me, like, I get that Charles Wallace is, like, not a normal child. He is, like, the proto John Greenian child. He is this, like, 7-year-old child who, like, is maybe psychic and who, like, ruminates and waxes poetic. And, like, I get it. But I had a very strained relationship with my siblings, and Meg loves Charles Wallace so purely. And Charles Wallace is such a cinnamon roll that he's just my favorite part of this book. Every part of him with him in it is always my favorite part of this entire book.
Interesting. So I did like Meg. There was like a little bit of a hurdle, again, because I do not read much middle grade. It's been so long that there was kind of in the beginning a lot of like, what is happening? And then, like, once I got through that kind of weird adjustment period, Meg came to be one of my favorite pieces of this story, and I definitely agree with you, the point about anger. I don't think that I had come to articulate it quite as well as you just did, so thank you for that, because I truly thank you for that. I think that was a lovely way of putting it, and I agree completely. Charles Wallace...
It's okay. Not everybody has to stand with me on the Charles Wallace side of the line. It's fine.
I didn't actively dislike it either. It was just this, like, I don't know, it was just this, like, weird quirk of the story that I was like, okay, I accept that this is happening. I'm not super into it. I also don't hate it. Whatever was kind of my feeling on that. However, I am like a huge sucker for any story that has sibling affection at its heart. This is a thing that we have talked about a bunch on the blog, but never quite gotten into on the podcast yet. But that for me is like an instant, like, oh, okay, all right, that's a sweet spot. That I think that there are just too many stories that hinge far too aggressively on romantic love, and so other kinds of love being represented as the heart of a story is always something that I appreciate. And so I truly loved that, like, sibling love was kind of the end game here. So that was also something that I thoroughly enjoyed about the story. I also enjoyed the other worlds. I was disappointed that we didn't spend more time there and getting to know them. I think like that to me would have been something that I would have appreciated more about this story, but I liked especially and I don't remember the names of any of these places, but where where Aunt Beast was, that place in particular, I thought was very, very interestingly represented. I appreciated the way that, like, those people were described and kind of the differences in perception and that kind of stuff. That was all very, very lovely, and I thoroughly enjoyed that.
I will echo two things and then add one of my own. First, I will say that I loved Meg pretty much right off the bat, and for the reasons that Chelsea said. The anger wasn't so much what caught me, but I immediately fell in love with her because she was emotional, as a whole. And
right.
I loved the idea that you have this young girl super into math. She's got
yes.
She's super into math. She feels very awkward, and she's kind of in that in-betweeny stage, which is difficult for anybody. And still, even as an adult, I can look back and be like, yeah, girl, I remember.
Yes.
Girl.
Yes.
But I love that she was emotional, and it was portrayed as something that was maybe a fault in her, but then that got flipped into a place where she could embrace that, and she could very much grow and be herself in that emotional place, because I am also very emotional. And I will...
You? No, never.
What? And I really do love, female characters, especially in stories like these. It reminded me a lot of Lyra from His Dark Materials.
Yes.
Because she is also a very precocious child at the head of this like big sci-fi fantasy kind of thing, and her big flaw is lying, and like she's very good at it. And that was probably like one of the first things that won me over to Lyra. So I got the same feeling from Meg, just this precocious child, head of this story, has some flaws, but it is something that ultimately endears you to her. So I loved Meg. I loved the sibling feels, even though I didn't have any feelings towards Charles Wallace one way or the other. At first I thought...
It's fine, guys. I will carry that flag so high and so far all on my own, and it is fine. I love him so much.
I will say I really liked him at the beginning in his introduction, where he's kind of waiting downstairs for his sister and his mother, and he has hot chocolate.
He makes his mom a sandwich.
Yes, I know.
Yes, that was very cute.
It was super cute. And so at first you get to really appreciate him, even though he's supposed to be. He's not supposed to be like a quote unquote normal child. He's supposed to be something a little bit more. And I think you get to really love him at the beginning. I think where it goes astray for me is just as a product of his story, he leaves for a portion of it. He is kind of sucked into the it, and it's not him anymore. And so you lose a little bit of the connection with his character because of that. But then it comes back around to the end, and Meg saves him with her love, and I'm on board because it's sibling love. So
yeah.
I was okay with that. And then just one more thing that I wanted to add on that I really liked. This book is obviously very theme heavy, and I think it is very obviously a story about good and evil. But for me, the thing that really won me over in the theme category was that it was also a story about nonconformity. And I really loved that so much in the sense that when it comes to being on, what's the name of the planet? Camazotz,
yeah.
There you go. When it comes to being on that planet, and it's like a manifestation of evil, basically, and there's like an evil power on there. But the way that it manifests is conformity. And so everybody is the same. And that's like the most damning thing that we hear.
Can I just like tin hat for a hot second?
Yeah.
Because like I've had a lot of time to think about this book, right? So Camazotz always struck me name-wise as particularly close to Camelot, which I always thought was a really interesting parallel, because like Camelot is supposed to be that like Arthurian utopia, right? And the idea of utopia is this kind of overwhelming peace and tranquility, and which is what they have on Camazotz, but it's through this very sinister and creepy, like subjugated, forced sameness, and there's like oblique mentions of like torture going on behind the scenes to get that achieved, and it's like super dark. But there's something there, guys. There's something there.
For me, that was one of the places that it lost me. So I enjoy the thematic idea of like conformity as being, essential to the evil. I think that more time kind of understanding how the other worlds tick might have improved the story for me. But the fact that the book finally stopped preaching at me only to start spinning this not particularly subtle anti-communist message was just like, oh my God. Like that for me was like, you're getting at something.
I mean,
that
do you feel like it's worth mentioning? It was published in 1962.
Yes. Oh, yes.
So like,
yes, absolutely. I understand.
But
like,
a little bit heavy-handed on the communism.
Yeah, it was so like on the nose with it. I was like, is this like the children's adaptation of like Ayn Rand? Like what's going on here? So that was a little like, again, it was something like there's something there, like there's concepts, there's ideas that I really, really dig and that I'm super into. But it was just like, that was an execution point that I was like, Come on, man. You were like, it's been a few pages since you've referenced something like explicitly Christian. Like, we're doing storytelling now. And instead, like, I thought we were doing that, but instead we're doing like another form of preaching, basically. That was just like, I don't know. That was difficult for me, I think. And again, this comes back to the like the when and where of me coming at this book. That like this was another thing that I had to kind of keep reminding myself of, that element of it. And again, I think that if I had come to this as a child, these feelings would be very, obviously I wouldn't have that reaction. Like 8-year-old Nicole wouldn't have been like, wow, this sure feels like an anti-communist message, like obviously. And so there's that piece of it. And I think that, and I also think like it's worth pointing out, like, cards on the table, right? Like, I am reading this in 2018 as a 29-year-old woman who is like hardcore liberal and like doesn't believe in God. So like there's so much going on in this book about like about the preaching that it's doing, that like I am just coming to it closed to. I am acknowledging that, to be clear, that it's also possible that I would be more willing to forgive it, that if it didn't happen to be presenting me with ideas that I am sort of already close to. Like we brought up, Lyra and his Dark Materials, which also gets very, very preachy at times with its sort of other end of the spectrum ideas, but they just happen to be ideas that I'm more open to, and so it doesn't bother me in the same way.
Well, and that's what's so fascinating, is because that was written in that book, or those series of books were written in response to the Wrinkles and Times and the Narnias and the so much coming from that Christian perspective. But I just think it's funny because very much so, like Marina, they remind me very much so of each other, although they're coming from completely opposite theological perspectives. So it's just interesting.
I think the reason that the whole communist message didn't get to me is exactly the reason that it got to you. Like, from the place where I'm coming from, I read that and I didn't immediately go, communism, because it wasn't like, this was written in the 60s, like we said, and that was something that was probably a little bit more present at that point. Not that, it isn't still a thing in 2018, but it just wasn't what jumped into my mind. We heard so much about Meg's struggles with conformity or nonconformity. Her entire opening and introduction really is about her own struggle. Like, she's asking her mom constantly, like, am I okay? Is something wrong with me? Is something wrong with Charles Wallace? Why are we so different? And she's having such a struggle with that by the time that they get to this world and the main issue on there is conformity, it seemed more like a projection of her own story arc and her own problems than a larger message. Until, now sitting back, I can see and be like, communism. But while I was reading, it wasn't something that really like naturally popped into my head. So that part didn't seem preachy to me, which is probably why I enjoyed that theme a little bit more than like the good and evil, the light and the dark part.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and I do think it's interesting because we are also coming to this as people who read like enough like SF and fantasy that like a lot of these things have become very tropey and very like so it's kind of hard to separate out. This came a little bit before a lot of that, so what actually seems tropey is like proto like that, and so it's just that's where it gets kind of hard for me to separate out some of these things I want to roll my eyes at and be like, okay, but at the time it wasn't necessarily every other sci-fi book that was coming out about the power of love to defeat ultimate evil. Like, so
even Meg herself, like if you're thinking about this book written by a woman in science fiction in the 1960s with another little girl at the head of the story, and she is a girl who is into math with a mother who is into science. Like, if you just put that into the context of its time, like, it's amazing, and I have to sit back and appreciate that for when it was written. And because we've had these moments a lot with Near Dark, and we were talking about Star Wars, where we have these stories that almost feel tropey when we are consuming them now, but you have to almost rewind and think about the way that they were the leaders in those genres rather than the actual, copiers, which I think this definitely is as well.
Yes, agreed.
Very much so.
The only other little positive thing that I wanted to mention is kind of a small thing, but we joke over on Snark Squad that you're getting old when you watch like teen shows and you consume like YA and you're paying more attention to the parents, like the stuff that you would fast forward in when you were in a teen.
That you'd skip through.
Yeah. It's actually the stuff where you're like, well, no, that's actually a pretty good story. So I have to bring up the Murrays, the parents, because I think one of the things that got me more emotional was the part where Mrs. Murray, the mother, says, I know this is going to be difficult for you to understand, but I'm still relatively young and I'm still very much in love with your father.
Yes.
And that moment of just like her loneliness and of having been a year apart from him and raising the kids on her own and still doing her experiments in the lab but cooking dinner on the Bunsen burner, like that whole thing, I just loved it so much.
That scene at the end where they literally like run across a field to each other, I still get like little tears every time. I get like a little choked up because it's so good.
Yes, I loved it so much.
And I have never thirsted for Mr. Murray like I have since I found out Chris Pine was going to be playing him, but that is like a whole different thing.
Up there with sibling feels, like good, healthy families in general. Like both parents are there and present and genuinely care about their children's lives, and were removed from the story to facilitate our protagonists' adventures in a way that didn't also make them like shitty, negligent parents, which is a rare find, and I definitely also loved that.
I love, too, that part of her story is that she gets super disappointed in her father for not saving her and not saving her brother. And she just that disillusionment of like, okay, you're my father, but you can't do everything, which she's a little young to have that moment, but it's definitely...
Like, I want to like snap into the mic, but I don't want to like spike my audio. Like, you get something a little different every time you reread. And every time I reread this book in my teens, that is always the thing that hit me in the hardest is like, yes, like you have got to learn to do it for yourself. There are always going to be people who are never going to be able to help you out. And like, that is a very hard lesson for children to learn. And that is a very rough part of like IRL life. And there's literally a line where Meg's like, I found my dad, and if things aren't going to be okay because I found him, I don't know if things are ever going to be okay again. And I was just like, ooh, damn, like, had some feelings in that
child,
one, like, for real.
Come here.
Like,
let me protect you.
You almost can't blame her because she's got... It's hinted at that she goes through whatever, like, dark, malevolent force, and it affects her in a way, a part of the story, and it's just after they rescue the father. So she's having all of these very angry and negative feelings, but I almost can't fault her at that moment because they're all directed at having left Charles Wallace behind. And so you're almost like, yeah, girl, like you fight for your brother, and she's the only one like, when are we gonna get my brother? And it is very almost annoying and petulant, but at the same time it's like, I understand, I get it. Like,
I loved it. Yes, that was I was totally with her on her like petulant, obnoxious, whatever. And then, you know, when everybody explains like, yeah, we've been working on this while you were like resting up and recovering. Calm down.
Like you've been asleep for a hot second, Frodo. Let's catch you up to the plan before you freak out.
Right.
Everybody chill.
Right. That whole bit, I loved that. Yes. Basically everything that happened the entire time that she was on that world with Aunt Beast, like that, A+. All of that was very good.
Before we jump into maybe some more of the negative things, any other positives?
This book gave me a rudimentary understanding of physics, and I really like that the title is all about math, and I just really think that the Tesseract is a cool concept and like way to travel. I'm very excited to see how they do it in the movie.
So this to me is like a pivot point between the positive and the negative.
Oh, see, there you go. I secretly knew that and was setting it up. That's what we're going to go with.
So I agree that I definitely enjoyed the way in which science was incorporated into the story, or I enjoyed the idea. This is like my running theme. It's like I enjoyed so many ideas. I just want to like tweak them, and I'm still genuinely super excited for this movie. The only reason I'm reading this book is because that trailer looks so fucking cool that I was like, yes, great. I have no idea what this is, but I'm here for it.
I mean, it doesn't even matter. It's Oprah. It's Oprah. It doesn't matter.
Like I literally do not care. This is Ava DuVernay, Oprah. Like I'm in. I'm down. So yes, I'm still super excited for this movie because there are so many ideas. Because the story, like there are things that I'm like, I feel like you could just bend it ever so slightly, and I would love this. And so yeah, the inclusion of all of this science into a children's book, very, very cool. It falls apart for me. Going back to my issues with kind of the preachiness, it felt like the idea of blending the science and religion just never happened. And we were constantly alternating. Like either we could do science or we can do religion. And that was frustrating because it felt like she was trying to say like we can have both, but it never got there for me. I felt like we were constantly having to kind of basically pick, like you're doing one or the other. And
Interesting.
That especially like hit for me too when the final thing is like love is the way she wins. But I also
love is all you need, Sweeney.
Love is all you need. Okay, but like the big bad here, this was like it's a big brain. Like that to me, first of all, independent of anything else, I was like, really?
I mean, it's not a great visual.
It's not.
It's really not a great visual.
Stupid. It's so stupid. And I had already been so bothered by this weird vacillation between religion and science. And so then the fact that she has to go and just like have all this love in her heart to defeat the big evil brain was like, ugh, you've set up something that you didn't mean to, but I can't not see it now that I do. I just like, what are you doing with that? So I don't know.
I think what's interesting to me, Sweeney, is that, because to me it was not science versus religion, it was always science versus literature, like left brain, right brain. Because a lot of what they quote is from the Bible, but they also quote a lot of Shakespeare and they quote a lot of Dante and they quote a lot of like other things. And so like maybe because like we said, there are personal things coming from the background that make us hit on different parts, but like the religious stuff just got swept up to me in this like kind of literature as a whole thing. So it was always very much so. And maybe that was just because in my childhood that was a like divide in my house, left brain, right brain, like stuff between my siblings and I. And so that was just always how it read to me. So I just think that was interesting. I mean, ultimately we get to the same place of like, the ultimate power to defeat the big slimy brain is love. So
this is really interesting to me because as somebody who has a degree in a science field and is also, I wouldn't say religious. A reader. I wouldn't say religious. I'm religious, but I have faith in certain things. I'm not an atheist. So I did not pick up any of that. I was just like, yeah, religion and science. What's the big deal? I don't know. It's like hearing you talk about this, like I did not really think about it at all. I did. I mean, obviously you can't come to this and not pick up the religious undertones. And Sweeney and I typically never talk about the things that we're going to talk about on the podcast beforehand, but I had to text her and just be like, girl, this is religious.
When she texted me, I responded immediately that I was very relieved because I was like, oh man, if I'm going to have to come be the atheist killjoy about this, like that, I kind of feel like, guys, did you notice that it's like real religious? So that was
like you said, they do
relief.
lead their list of influential planet saviors as Jesus.
Yeah. Okay. It was just like,
they get like Marie Curie in there too, but she's like kind of a couple bumps down on the list.
I think also like just apart from like the copy pasting of like the Bible into the story in certain areas, because I grew up in a Christian household, there was so much of the language that was just coded as religious. I don't know if you guys picked up on some of that stuff as well, but there was just some phrasing and some things that they said that I was just like, man, I've heard that like in church before or in like sermons and stuff. So that was really the stuff that was, standing out to me more than anything else. But I did not really put into perspective like the religion versus science thing. I never really felt that they were at odds while I was reading.
Oh, to be clear, I don't think that they were intended to be at odds. I think that the goal was you can have both, which is a good and interesting idea. And I certainly, and not one that I disagree with. I don't think that it is impossible. I think you can, believe that science is real and also be a religious person. Obviously those two things are not inconsistent. I think that they were presented as inconsistent unintentionally because we were constantly having to jump back and forth between the modes of plot progression. Either we were doing, love or we were doing Tessera. You know what I mean? It's in this way that was just you're trying to get to something and I don't think you're actually getting there.
I will say that one of my negatives, maybe now that I'm thinking about it, plays into this a little bit because I think that another big theme of the book is that some things are are unanswerable. There are some things that we don't have answers for. And I think Meg struggles against that a lot. Like she wants all of the answers right away. And so whether it's science or faith, you know, the book seems to be saying that there are things that we cannot know, at least immediately. And one of my least favorite like tropes or devices in stories is I'll tell you later. And this entire book is a big fat I will tell you later.
Mata, you realize that this book would have been like 8 pages long. Mrs. Watson, Mrs. Woods, just been like, okay, listen, here's where your dad is, and here's what the problem is. Like, it won't work like that.
Yeah, and I didn't like it.
I mean, that's totally valid.
It would have been a solid 8 pages, is what I'm saying.
World's best short story. Okay, so my thing is like, okay, listen, Calvin and the kiss, and I just can't. I never could, and I still can't. This is a book that is about this girl coming to terms with herself and her identity and her father and her brother, and like, why we gotta shove that kiss in there, man? Like, it just is so unnecessary. And it's not like it's a huge thing. I don't want anybody who hasn't read it thinking it's this like melodramatic,
it's
huge romance thing. It's very minor, but it is. It was major to me. I had feelings about it, and they were not happy feelings. I did not like it. Calvin does not need to be all up in her space. She is literally trying to go fucking save her baby brother from like the big bad, and he's like, "Let me just smooch you up all." I just can't with Calvin. No, thank you.
I like that this is like a grudge that you've been carrying around for 20 years.
Very long time. Like, that's the thing about this movie coming out is it has given me the chance to unearth some like feelings I have had about A Wrinkle in Time for a long time that I haven't really gotten to dig into.
So there are other stories, and we already mentioned His Dark Material, and one of my favorites is the Fairyland series that deals with this as well, that has like young characters in a quasi-romantic kind of relationship, and it's always super awkward because they're young and you're not really sure how to deal with that. I think Avatar: The Last Airbender, which is an animated series, does this as well, where they're just young and pushed together, and you can tell that there is something there. But I think with all of those examples that I just named, it builds over time, and like by the end of the Fairyland series, she's 17. So by the time that you really feel like this is a romantic maybe situation, they've grown older or they've spent a lot of time with each other. To me, the Calvin thing was more like, because it's like, whoa boy, we just met you, like this is
well, and also they're supposed to be, I mean, they're obviously old enough that like developing romantic attractions is like a thing, but they're also on the younger end of that spectrum. And again, she's got a lot of shit that she's trying to like all figure out right there. So like maybe watch your timing, Calvin. Like maybe just like step back a hot inch and read the room and like time that for later. Whatever. I definitely don't have feelings about it.
It wasn't necessary. Just because everything that you felt, everything that Calvin you felt what was between them without the kiss. You know, you saw that they were like developing feelings in that kind of way, or that they were at least, you know, getting to know each other. He was becoming more like kind of the family. He has a shitty family life. Like all of that was not said without the kiss. He said some
very sweet things to her. And if that's where it had stopped, I would have been like, cool, all right, like I'm down for this. Let's push it back to, like you were saying, Mary, like a couple books back a little bit. Like give us a minute to deal with this intergalactic evil father kidnapping situation thing we got going on over here to the left. Like we have some things to deal with. Oh man. I'm good. I feel good. I feel resolved now. I feel like I've like gotten a chance to like let some of that go a little bit.
Yes, media therapy.
My quibbles are small but mighty. Do you guys like the casting? Do you guys like now that you know who is who in the characters?
So I looked up IMDb as soon as I started reading, mostly because I wanted to place Reese Witherspoon, Mindy Kaling, and Oprah. Like that was like the essential thing, was I needed to know who was who of them. And I was like mentally correcting the book when it would name them. I'm like, oh, you mean Reese Witherspoon.
I do believe you mean Mindy. I do believe you are referring to Mindy.
So, yes. And just in general, because I was like, yeah, I have the option to, you know, mentally picture all of these people instead. And I could do that with tremendous ease, and I'm very excited about it.
I'm very excited.
I put off looking at, I had seen promotional stuff and maybe like glimpses of the trailer, but I put off looking at the trailer as a whole until I finished the book. And so that was a treat at the end where I was like, look at all this wonderful stuff. I'm so excited. Yeah. And then I made the mistake of scrolling down and looking at the YouTube comments. So,
oh, no.
Yeah,
Never do that.
But it was basically a bunch of like, diversity, who needs it kind of thing. So people,
As I flip back my social justice warrior cape, let me tell you in a hot second about how amazing this movie's going to be. Like, the highlights of my 2017 on Twitter were anytime that A Wrinkle in Time, Star Wars, or Black Panther had like a press day or released a preview or like did a thing, because this movie and Black Panther are my like 2 2018 releases that I am just like so ready to get down on. I think it's going to be amazing. I love that the Meg that they cast is going to be like biracial in canon. Storm Reed is an amazing actress. I am so excited for all of these things to happen.
I am really
I
excited
also
too.
just am like to people reacting that way. Like, did you read the fucking book?
Right.
Spoiler alert, the casting diversity is not going to be where your problems with this movie stop, friend. It's just not.
It's not subtle about its messages, and I can assure you, like, this is literally like your obsession with I don't know, whatever, with like white people that are at odds with the thematic underpinnings.
Well, yeah, because like that whole scene of like that neighborhood of conforming white people is going to read contextually like, yes, creepy, but in a very different level of creepy in 2018 than it did even in like 1962.
Yes.
Like it's just going to visually read very differently.
Yes.
I'm also interested to see what tweaks they make, because I do think it's a story that needs some updating. And if I know Ava DuVernay, she's going to do some, I think, really interesting things with the movie.
I think also, too, it's interesting that people would be like, different things and people, because even the planet where Aunt Beast is, like that entire idea of like we communicate things differently, we see things differently, like we're different creatures, and that affects the way we communicate with each other and understand each other. And I don't know, I think that this is just such a, I mean, I think everything should be diverse ever, but also that this is such a right story for that because of its core messaging. But a lot of it is just a lot of people like, well, that's not how it was in the book. So
oh God, fucking miss me with your textual accuracy.
I know.
It makes me by a mile. I cannot even be here for
Not
it.
at all.
Ugh, no, thank you. But I am just, it's going to be very, very good. I love that it's a family movie. It's going to be pitched to kids. It's going to be hitting those people who I think need to see people like themselves the most. It's going to be super
It's going to be great for people who are thirsty for Mr. Murray.
guys. It is just, listen.
It is a nice thing about, this being an older book, right? So like you can have read this as a child and then now grow up and be an adult. So when you were little, you were like, oh, yay, Meg. And now you're like, okay, well, I'm a grown-ass adult now, and my interests have changed. So
I'm like, I don't know if you guys have seen Gugu Mbatha-Raw, who's going to be playing Meg's mom, but like, oh, goddamn, man, I don't know which one of those two I thirst after her or Chris Pine, because like that is a very attractive like set of people that they have gotten involved in this movie, and I'm very excited.
That is all for us this week. We want to thank Chelsea once again for being on this episode with us, and we want to invite all of you guys to chat with us about A Wrinkle in Time. You can find us over at SnarkSquad.com or on Twitter at Snark_squad. You can find me at My Name is Madeleine.
I am at Sweeney Says.
And I am at An Outlaw Life.
We also want to thank Stefan Chin for the fancy music that you are listening to right now. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we will catch you again next episode. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.